In the early months of 1945, the Isle of Man was a place shaped by wind more than by people. The wind arrived from the Irish Sea with a steady force, rolling over the cliffs and across the empty fields, carrying the scent of salt and cold stones. It was not a violent wind, but it was relentless, and the men arriving as prisoners could feel that it belonged to this island far more than they ever would. When the military trucks carrying German prisoners slowed to a stop along the narrow coastal road, many of the men lifted their heads, not out of curiosity, but out of a deep instinctive need to understand the environment they had been delivered to. The island did not offer much explanation. It offered only its smell, a mixture of seawater, dried on black rocks, damp earth, wet wood, and a faint trace of something hollow, as though the air held an echo that had never fully disappeared. Friedrich Kron stepped down from the back of one of the trucks and felt that smell become part of his first breath on the island. The ground beneath his boots was soft with moisture, and the wind pushed at his coat without hesitation, as if testing the shape of him. The guards ordered the prisoners into formation with practiced voices, but the wind carried those orders away almost as quickly as they were spoken. The men lined up out of discipline rather than out of fear, and their shadows stretched in narrow shapes across the gray earth. The wire fences surrounding the camp stood like thin lines drawn against the sky. The metal vibrated in the wind, producing a low hum that repeated without pause. It was not loud, but it was constant, and in that quiet environment it became a kind of boundary, telling the men that whatever they had been before the war had no authority here inside the camp. The barracks were arranged in rows like long wooden boxes. Their walls were always cool and slightly wet. Friedrich entered the one assigned to his group and found that the air inside carried the smell of old timber, wool that had been worn too many times, and the lingering fatigue of men who had lived here for months. The beds were narrow, built from metal frames that creaked with even the slightest movement. At night, the sound filled the room in small, irregular intervals. It was not comforting, but it reminded the prisoners that they were surrounded by others who were still alive. The food provided in the camp never changed. The bread was stiff and required effort to bite into. The soup was thin, barely warm. Carrying more water than flavor meat appeared only on rare occasions. The men ate without speaking, because eating was not a moment to share, but a task to complete. Hunger was common, almost expected, and it formed a quiet background to each day. What weighed on the men more heavily was the absence of the future. Days in the camp had no clear shape. They began and ended without marking anything new. The prisoners were given tasks, but these tasks did not build anything. They carried timber from one area to another, removed stones that storms had blown onto the paths, repaired fences that the wind had bent. When their work was done, their coats carried a fine layer of dried salt from the sea air, and their hands were cold from the dampness that never left the island. In the evenings, the wind pushed its way through the cracks in the barrack walls. It touched the men's blankets, making them shift slightly in their sleep. Some men woke because of the wind. Others woke because of the dreams they no longer tried to remember. Friedrich, who had once been a footballer in a small village club, felt himself losing the ability to imagine what weeks or months might look like. Time dissolved into a sequence of identical days, and he could not tell where one ended and the next began. He remembered the feeling of running, the certainty of placing one foot in front of the other with purpose, the instinctive understanding of how to turn his body before the ball reached him. But inside the camp, movement meant nothing. Speed meant nothing. Direction meant nothing. His steps no longer carried purpose. They carried only obligation. The camp was often quiet, not a peaceful quiet, but a quiet that existed because nothing new happened. The guards walked their routes with measured steps. They did not shout. They did not smile. They did not treat the prisoners with cruelty, but they did not treat them with friendship either. Their behavior suggested that the war had made them into instruments rather than individuals, and the prisoners recognized this transformation because they felt similar changes within themselves. Then, on an afternoon when nothing significant was expected to occur, a small sound disrupted the familiar rhythm of the camp. Behind the tool shed, where old boards leaned against the wall and sacks of materials were stacked without care, something struck the ground with a dull, bouncing noise. The sound was modest, but in a place where the wind carried nearly every noise away, it felt distinct. Several men turned their heads toward the direction of the noise. A football rolled out from behind the tool shed. Its leather was cracked and dry, its seams swollen from exposure to moisture, its shape slightly distorted. It looked like an object that had once belonged to a different world, a world with open fields and clear afternoons, a world where men had the freedom to move without permission. The prisoners froze, not because the ball frightened them, but because it reminded them of something too familiar, something that felt almost impossible to encounter here. Friedrich looked at the ball and felt a tight sensation inside his chest. He did not step toward it. He did not lift his hand. He simply watched, uncertain whether the memory that surfaced in him was a comfort or a threat. The other men stood in place as well. They waited, not knowing whether touching the ball would violate an unspoken rule. The wind carried their breath in uneven clouds, and for a brief moment, the entire world seemed to pause, as if observing their hesitation. Then Thomas, one of the guards who often patrolled near the lake, walked past at a steady pace. He glanced at the ball but did not approach it. He did not frown. He did not shout. He simply looked for a moment, then continued along his route. That small gesture was enough. It was not permission, but it was not denial. It was a space large enough for the prisoners to step into. One of the older prisoners stepped forward first. He bent down slowly, as though approaching something fragile, and reached for the ball. When his fingers touched the cracked leather, he hesitated for a brief moment, then lifted it carefully. The ball felt lighter than he expected, almost hollow, and when he set it on the ground again and tapped it with the tip of his boot, it rolled forward in a faint, uncertain wobble. The men watched its movement, as though witnessing a small disruption in the order that had held their days together. The ball completed its uneven path and came to rest near a patch of wet earth. No one moved immediately, but something inside them shifted. It was not excitement, not hope, but a quiet recognition of a memory that had lived in them long before the war. In the days that followed, the ball reappeared during the short rest periods between work and roll call. No one gave instructions. No one announced that play was allowed. Yet the men gathered around it naturally, their bodies drawn toward the simple object that connected their present to a distant past. They tapped the ball with soft touches, careful not to damage it, careful not to awaken too much emotion at once. The sound of leather meeting the ground was muted but distinct, a small pattern of noise that soon blended into the rhythm of the camp. Friedrich watched from a distance at first. He stood with his hands behind his back, his expression calm but distant, as though trying to guard himself from the emotions the ball might awaken. He had forgotten many things during his months of captivity, but he had not forgotten the sensation of a ball near his feet. He remembered the anticipation that came just before he touched it, the way his muscles prepared without needing direction, the way his mind quieted when the field opened before him. Those memories were sharp, too sharp, and he did not yet know whether they could survive the heaviness his life had taken on. The third day after the ball appeared, a small group of prisoners gathered again during rest time. The ground was damp and uneven, but they stood in a loose circle, nudging the ball from one man to another. The touches grew slightly stronger, slightly more confident. The men still avoided overt enthusiasm, understanding that too much energy might draw the wrong kind of attention, but they allowed themselves enough movement to feel the faintest return of control. Friedrich stayed near the edge of the group. At one point, the ball rolled toward him in a slow arc, pushed by an uncertain pass. He watched it approach, his body responding before his thoughts had time to intervene. When the ball reached him, he raised his foot and stopped it with a gentle downward motion. The leather was cold beneath his boot, and the small impact sent a familiar echo through his leg. He exhaled without realizing he had been holding his breath. He touched the ball again, lightly, rolling it forward a few inches. It was a simple motion, almost insignificant, but it carried the weight of everything he had forgotten and everything he was afraid to remember. Thomas walked past at that moment. His posture was straight, and his expression remained composed, yet his eyes paused for a brief second as he watched Friedrich touch the ball. The moment passed quickly, but it was long enough for Friedrich to understand that the guard had seen his movement and chosen not to intervene. That quiet choice carried meaning in a place where choices were rare. Over the next several days, the presence of the ball became a predictable part of the camp's rhythm. The men moved more fluidly, still cautious, but no longer fearful. Their touches grew more coordinated, and a faint pattern began to form among them. When one man received the ball, the others instinctively shifted their positions, creating small openings and anticipating the next pass. These movements were clumsy at times, slowed by fatigue and hunger, but they carried the unmistakable imprint of lives once lived outside the camp's boundaries. Friedrich began participating with more regularity. He did not try to dominate the small exchanges. He did not reclaim the identity he had once held as a player. Instead, he stayed within the pace of the group, offering simple touches and steady passes. His movements were not those of a man trying to win anything. They were the movements of someone remembering how to share space with others. The wind that swept across the lake carried their breath away in faint trails, and the men gradually learned how to move in harmony despite their weakened bodies. It was during one of these quiet rest periods that a small incident revealed something unexpected. A supply cart arrived at the tool shed, and as the crates were unloaded, a sack slipped from one of the soldiers' hands and burst open on the ground. The impact sent several pieces of cloth and loose objects scattering across the dirt. One of them struck the ball and sent it rolling sharply toward the wire fence near the patrol line. Thomas was walking his route at that exact moment. He saw the ball approaching and stepped toward it without hesitation. With a simple, instinctive motion, he brought his foot down lightly and stopped the ball beneath his boot. The movement was smooth and confident. The movement of someone who knew how to control a ball rather than someone merely trying to clear an obstacle. The prisoners froze where they stood. Their expressions were not tense, but they carried a quiet intensity. Thomas looked down at the ball with a slight frown, as though surprised by his own reflex. Then he shifted his weight and tapped the ball forward with the inside of his foot, sending it back toward the prisoners. The pass was gentle, yet precise enough to reveal that it was not the first time he had touched a football. The ball rolled across the ground and came to rest near Friedrich. The men held their breath for a moment, and in that silence something unspoken passed between guard and prisoners. It was not trust. It was not friendship. It was recognition. The next day the men approached the field with a different kind of energy. It was still quiet, still understated, but the ball moved more freely among them. Their passes extended over longer distances. Their formations, though unofficial, became more organized. The guards did not comment on the change. Some looked on with curiosity. Others ignored it entirely. What mattered was that no one stepped in to stop the movement. In the days that followed, the makeshift play area beside the lake evolved into an informal meeting point. The men gathered there whenever work allowed, shaping small moments of coordination and motion. The cold air made their cheeks red and their noses sting, but the movements warmed their bodies in ways they had not felt in months. Friedrich found that with each pass, each small gesture, a part of himself resurfaced. He noticed angles again. He noticed the way the ball responded to different touches. He noticed the tone of the ground, soft in some areas, firm in others. These small details carried a strange comfort, like pieces of an old world fitting back into place. As the small games continued, the prisoners gradually learned how to conserve their limited strength. They adjusted their pace, shortened their steps, and passed the ball in ways that reduced unnecessary strain. Yet even with these precautions, something subtle began to grow in their movements. The passing became cleaner, the touches more deliberate, and the gestures exchanged between men more expressive than their words had been in weeks. The camp itself began to change in response. It did not become more welcoming, and the weather did not soften, but the atmosphere took on a new texture. The wind, which once carried only coldness, now carried faint traces of breath and movement from the men who kicked the ball at the lake's edge. Even the guards felt the shift. Their patrols remained orderly, but the rigidness in their shoulders relaxed slightly as they observed the harmless rhythm forming among the prisoners. They were not encouraging what was happening, but neither were they resisting it. The war had taken many things from everyone involved, and perhaps even the guards sensed that this small form of motion was not something worth suppressing. One afternoon, after days of tentative practice, the prisoners began arranging themselves in a rough formation. There was no strategy and no explicit instruction. They simply divided into two groups, each man choosing a side based on familiarity or instinct. The ball traveled between them with an uneven but genuine rhythm. Ground was muddy and slippery in some areas, firm in others, and every kick left a faint impression that faded as quickly as it was made. Friedrich positioned himself near the left side of the makeshift field. He did not declare a role, but his body returned naturally to the place where he had once been most comfortable. He watched the field not with calculation, but with an instinctive awareness of the space around him. When the ball reached him, he guided it with the side of his boot and passed it toward an open area. His movement was simple and smooth, but it carried a familiarity that reminded the others of what they had forgotten. Thomas stood at the edge of the field, observing the activity with a steady seriousness. His posture was alert but not tense, and his eyes followed the ball as though evaluating its trajectory. After a while, he stepped closer, his boots leaving shallow impressions in the wet earth. He did not cross the boundary into the field, but he remained close enough to watch more clearly. The prisoners noticed his proximity, but did not change their pace. Their movements had become quiet enough to avoid raising concern, and the sense of caution that had once controlled them had settled into a disciplined calm. When the ball drifted toward the patrol line again, Thomas reached out with a familiar motion to control it. The ball rolled to a stop beneath his boot. He hesitated for a moment, glanced at the nearest prisoner, then nudged it back onto the field with a short, steady pass. Something in the pass revealed more than he intended. It revealed a history. It revealed that he, too, had known the game before the war changed his life. The prisoners felt the weight of that silent admission. Among men who rarely spoke openly, the ball had become a language of its own. Over the next days, the line separating guards and prisoners blurred in small but unmistakable ways. The guards remained guards. Their duties continued, and their authority stayed intact. Yet the presence of the ball created a space where interactions became less defined by roles and more defined by shared human memory. Late one afternoon, as the prisoners began yet another quiet exchange of passes, Thomas approached the group with a measured step. He stopped a few feet from the edge of the field, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and then stepped into an open position opposite Friedrich. He did not ask to join. He simply placed himself in a posture that made participation possible. The prisoners exchanged cautious glances. No one objected. No one questioned the moment. Instead, the ball was passed forward again, and Thomas's first touch was light but certain. The match began slowly. The prisoners adjusted their movements, making sure to maintain distance and avoid any unintended conflict. Thomas moved with controlled effort, mindful of the environment, mindful of the fragile balance that allowed this match to exist. His passes were measured, and his steps stayed within a narrow range, but his movements grew more fluid with each exchange. The field was uneven, and the mud clung to the soldiers' boots, slowing every motion, but the physical struggle did not diminish the sense of meaning in each touch of the ball. Friedrich found himself running beside Thomas during one sequence of play. Their boots splashed through the shallow water near the field's edge. Their breaths formed small clouds that rose into the cold air. Neither man looked at the other directly, but their steps aligned for several seconds, creating a brief, unplanned harmony. It lasted only until the mud shifted beneath them. Friedrich slipped first, and Thomas reached out, steadying him with one hand before stepping away. The gesture was small and quickly forgotten by anyone watching, but Friedrich felt its weight. It was the first time in months that another man had touched him, without the touch being part of an order or a search. The game lasted longer that afternoon than any previous one. It was not because the men had greater strength. It was because the rhythm of play gave them something to hold on to. Each movement helped push the weight of captivity slightly aside. Each breath, each shift of the foot, reminded them of a period when their bodies had been instruments of choice rather than instruments of survival. When the guards signaled the end of rest time, the men allowed the match to fade into stillness. They did not protest. They did not complain. They simply watched the ball roll to a stop and then walked back toward the barracks with quiet composure. Later that night, inside the dim barracks, the men settled onto their bunks. Their bodies ached in unfamiliar ways, but the ache brought with it a sense of grounding. The darkness did not feel as heavy as before. Friedrich lay awake longer than the others, replaying the moment when Thomas had steadied him. He did not believe it signaled friendship. He did not assign meaning that was not there, but he understood that war had not succeeded in stripping every man of recognition. Some parts of them survived, buried, yet unbroken. In the following days, the match repeated itself in different forms. Sometimes the guards joined, sometimes they stood aside, sometimes they watched with folded arms, but no one tried to halt the growing familiarity of movement among the prisoners. The field beside the lake became a space defined not by orders but by shared rhythms. It was not freedom, but it was something softer than confinement. The air carried it. The men felt it. Even the wind, relentless as it was, seemed to accept it. As winter weakened and the first signs of spring approached the Isle of Man, the camp experienced a shift that was subtle yet unmistakable. The wind was still cold and the sky remained heavy with clouds, but something in the air had changed. It was not warmth, not yet, but a quiet loosening of the grip that the long months of confinement had held over the prisoners' spirits. The football continued to appear during rest periods, and it became a familiar presence that shaped the rhythm of the men's days. Each time they touched it, each time it rolled across the wet ground, it gathered stories that were not written in any official record. The guards never addressed the matches directly, but they no longer positioned themselves in ways that discouraged play. Their footsteps sounded lighter, and some of them watched the games with the curiosity of people observing something that reminded them of a distant past. Friedman, one of the older guards, commented softly to another soldier one afternoon, saying that the ball did no harm and that the prisoners looked calmer when they played. It was not a grand approval, but it was one more sign that the matches had become part of the daily life in the camp. For Friedrich, the quiet expansion of time brought with it a renewed sense of awareness. His movements grew stronger, not dramatically, but in steady increments. He began to anticipate the ball's motion with clearer instincts. He saw openings before they appeared, judged the weight of passes more carefully, and responded to the movements of others with a growing sense of connection. He was no longer merely remembering the game. He was beginning to participate in it with intent. One afternoon, a group of prisoners began arranging themselves into two loose teams with more defined structure. They positioned themselves across the field, some closer to the edges, others nearer the center. still did not resemble a formal match, but the positions revealed their understanding of the game. Friedrich stepped into the left side again, settling into a familiar arc that matched his old habits. His boots pressed into the mud, leaving behind small imprints that faded as quickly as they appeared. The ball passed through the group in a scattered but coherent flow. Sometimes it reached Friedrich, sometimes it didn't, but he was always ready, adjusting his stance, watching the others, absorbing the movement. Thomas approached shortly after the match began. He stopped near the patrol line and watched with a thoughtful expression. His rifle hung over his shoulder, but his hands rested calmly at his sides. He observed the field with a familiarity that was becoming increasingly noticeable. After several minutes, he stepped closer, his boots making a soft sound on the damp earth. He still did not assume authority over the match. He simply positioned himself near the boundary and waited. Eventually, the ball drifted toward him. It was not an intentional pass. It carried the irregular path of a poorly controlled touch, bouncing unevenly toward his boots. Thomas responded with a quiet motion, stepping forward and stopping the ball with the inside of his foot. The prisoners paused. No one moved. The wind brushed across the field as though testing the air. Thomas looked at the ball, then lifted his foot. He tapped it toward the nearest prisoner with a controlled pass that carried no force, but demonstrated precision. It was the pass of someone who understood the weight and balance of the ball. The match resumed. Friedrich received a pass and guided it toward the corner, allowing his body to settle into a pattern that had once been second nature. Thomas followed from a distance, never moving into a role that crossed boundaries, but maintaining a presence that acknowledged his familiarity with the game. During one sequence of play, Friedrich found himself advancing with the ball along the left side. He leaned into the movement, shifting his weight with experienced balance. The wind pushed against him from the side, forcing him to adjust his steps. As he approached a puddle, ground grew softer, and his foot sank deeper than expected. The ball slipped slightly out of his control, but he regained it with a minor adjustment, nudging it forward. Thomas, watching closely, moved a few steps toward him, not to challenge, but to support the flow of the match. Their paths converged in a way that felt almost orchestrated. For several seconds they ran near each other, their feet splashing through the damp earth, their breaths forming visible clouds. Friedrich angled the ball inward, preparing to make a pass. He slipped suddenly, his boot sliding across a patch of slick mud. As he fell, Thomas reached out instinctively, placing a firm hand on Friedrich's arm and steadying him. The touch lasted only a second, but it carried a depth that neither man could ignore. It was not a gesture of friendship and not a gesture of authority. It was simply one person supporting another in a moment of imbalance. No words were exchanged. They continued the match without acknowledging the moment openly, but something in the atmosphere shifted. The men's movements grew more cohesive, as though steadying one man had somehow steadied something larger within the group. For the next 20 minutes, the ball moved in a rhythm more fluid than anything the camp had seen before. It still lacked speed and elegance, but it carried an intention that gave shape to the field. The match lasted until the guards called the end of rest time. As always, it ended quietly, without ceremony. The ball rolled to a stop near the lake, and the men walked back to the barracks in silent groups. That night, the barracks carried a different kind of quiet. It was not the heavy silence of confinement, but a softer one that felt almost restorative. The creaking of metal beds, the rustle of blankets, the sighs of men settling into their bunks. All these sounds formed a muted harmony that echoed through the room. Friedrich lay awake for a while, staring at the ceiling planks above him. He thought about the moment when Thomas steadied him. He thought about the ball rolling through the puddles, the wind brushing across the field, the shared breaths of the men running beside him. He felt the ache in his legs and the sharpness in his lungs from exertion. It was an ache he welcomed. It reminded him that he was still capable of movement, still capable of being part of something larger than himself. Over the next few days, the matches continued with an almost predictable rhythm. The men grew accustomed to the pattern of play. Their bodies adapted, and even their expressions shifted in subtle ways. Their eyes no longer carried only the distant, unfocused look of prisoners. There was a new depth, a new sense of awareness. It was not joy, and it was not hope. It was something smaller, but no less meaningful: presence. They were present in their bodies, present in their steps, present in each moment the ball traveled across the ground. The camp entered a phase of quiet equilibrium. The guards allowed the matches to continue as long as they remained orderly. The prisoners adhered to this unspoken agreement, never pushing the boundaries of play, always maintaining respect for the limits imposed upon them. The ball became a mediator between the two sides, a silent witness to the slow rebuilding of humanity in a place where it had nearly disappeared. As April turned toward May, the winds over the Isle of Man carried faint hints of change. It was not visible in the sky, which remained a muted gray, nor in the sea, which continued its ceaseless movement. The change arrived instead in the form of distant rumors, scattered phrases overheard from guards, brief exchanges that drifted across the camp like small, unsteady birds. The prisoners sensed that something significant was approaching, though they did not yet dare to believe it. Days earlier than usual, Thomas appeared at the edge of the field one afternoon. His steps were slower, and he seemed distracted by thoughts that lay beyond the boundary of his duties. Friedrich watched him quietly, sensing a tension that had not been present before. The other prisoners noticed it as well, but no one spoke. When the ball rolled toward Thomas during a pause in play, he controlled it with a practiced touch, then rested his foot on top of it, rather than passing it back immediately. He looked at the men with a seriousness that made the wind seem to hush. Then he lifted the ball and placed it gently in the muddy grass. Without a word, he turned and walked away. The prisoners understood that something profound had changed. The following morning, the guards summoned the camp into formation. The air felt charged, as though the island itself had paused to listen. The senior officer stood before the men, holding a sheet of paper that he unfolded slowly. His voice was steady as he delivered the announcement. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The prisoners listened without reaction at first, not because they did not understand, but because they had forgotten how to express anything that resembled relief. The words hung in the air like a fragile structure, too delicate to touch. The officer continued, explaining that arrangements would be made for repatriation. The men would be returned to the mainland in groups, transported across the sea, and then sent to their respective regions over time. The process would not be immediate, but it would begin soon. When the formation dissolved, the prisoners walked back to the barracks in a slow, contemplative silence. Some looked at the ground, some at the sky, some at the distant outline of the lake. Friedrich felt a weight inside him that he did not understand. He had imagined the war ending many times, but the reality carried a complexity he could not untangle. Freedom meant returning home, but home itself was now an uncertain idea. He had no way of knowing what remained, or whether the life he had left behind still existed in any form. Over the next several days, the camp shifted into a state of gentle disarray. The guards' voices were softer, their movements less rigid. Some of the younger soldiers even offered brief nods or quiet words as they passed by the prisoners. There was no celebration, but there was a sense of release spreading through the camp like slow-moving light. The football remained by the field, its leather still cracked, but still capable of rolling. The men continued to gather for matches, though their movements were more reflective now, less driven by the need to escape the stillness of confinement. They played with the awareness that these matches might be among their last together. On one of those afternoons, Thomas approached Friedrich before the match began. He stood a few feet away and spoke in a low voice, telling Friedrich that his group would likely be among the first to leave the island. Friedrich listened silently, feeling the wind brush against his face. Thomas looked at the field, at the scattered footprints left by the earlier games. Then he nodded once, a small gesture that carried the weight of a farewell between men who had shared something without ever naming it. The next morning, Friedrich stood with his group near the lake, looking out at the water as the wind pushed small ripples across its surface. The ball lay nearby, resting in a shallow puddle. It had lost much of its shape, but to Friedrich it looked exactly as it had the first time he saw it. A few prisoners walked past it, but did not touch it. The moment felt too quiet, too fragile to disturb. Friedrich moved closer, stopped a few feet away, and crouched down. He placed his fingers lightly on the ball, feeling the roughness of its worn leather. He turned it slightly, watching the mud shift beneath it. For a moment he considered lifting it, but instead he let it remain where it was. He stood and walked toward the assembly point without looking back immediately. When he finally turned, he saw Thomas standing on the patrol line near the lake. The guard's coat lifted in the wind, and his hands rested by his sides. Their eyes met across the open field. Thomas made no gesture, but something in his expression conveyed a quiet message that what had happened between them during the matches would remain in his memory long after the war was only a distant story. The prisoners boarded the transport trucks and were driven toward the docks where the boat waited. The wire fences that had defined their world for months stretched behind them in long, still lines. The wind moved across them, but they did not hum as they usually did. They stood silent, watching the men depart. As Friedrich stepped onto the boat, he turned toward the island. One last time, he saw the muddy patch of earth beside the lake, faintly marked by the footsteps of the men who had played there. There was no ball now, no formation, no running figures, The field looked ordinary, like any piece of ground that had held too much water for too long. Yet Friedrich felt something rise in him, a clarity that surprised him. He understood that the field had given him back a part of himself, not as triumph, not as victory, but as memory. The boat pulled away from the shore. The island grew smaller, its cliffs fading into the gray sky. Friedrich remained at the rail, watching until the wind obscured the view. Many years passed before the story of the matches resurfaced. A former guard, older now, spoke about the camp in an interview. When asked whether anything unusual had happened during his service, he paused for a long moment. Then he spoke softly about the football that appeared one afternoon, and about the matches that followed. He said the games had not been formal, had not been recorded, had not been the kind of events that history books captured. But for a short time, he said, the matches allowed everyone involved to forget their roles. They forgot the uniforms, the fences, the unending wind. They remembered only that they had once been boys who knew how to run across open fields, that they had once belonged to a world where movement was free. He said that people later called the matches small and insignificant, but he never believed they were small. To him, they were the proof that war could confine the body but could not fully claim the human spirit. The interviewer asked whether he remembered any of the prisoners specifically. The guard hesitated, then replied that he remembered one, a man on the left side of the field who moved with patience and control. He could not recall the prisoner's name, but he remembered the way the man steadied the ball under pressure, the way he ran with quiet determination, and the way he looked toward the lake after the final match, as though he understood something the guard could not fully see. When the interview ended, the guard remained sitting for a long while. He stared at his hands, perhaps remembering the feel of the ball beneath his boot, and in that moment the boundary between past and present softened, just as it had softened on those quiet afternoons beside the lake, when men on opposite sides of a war had passed a worn football back and forth on a muddy piece of ground. That memory, more than any order or uniform, had endured, and through it, the guard knew that on the Isle of Man, for a brief period in 1945, the war had been interrupted not by treaties or announcements, but by movement, the simplest, most human form of connection that survived even in captivity.